Lying about dice rolls is a polarising subject within the tabletop role-playing game community. Some consider it one of the worst things you can do, whereas others use it every single session. So let's talk about it and let's answer that question. Should you in fact ever fudge a dice roll whilst playing Dungeons & Dragons? My name's Aaron, welcome to the DM's Playbook, where we talk all things D&D with new videos every single Tuesday. So let's get straight into it. As a player, should you ever fudge a dice roll? For me, there's actually a very simple answer to this one. No. As a player, you should not be fudging dice rolls whilst playing Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, if you open the player handbook to page 1 of the introduction, it talks so much in there about specifically how much dice are to do with playing Dungeons & Dragons and how they can affect all the different outcomes. And if you're going to be playing in a way that means you can fudge dice rolls, then you may as well not play with dice. I'm a big believer in the fact that actually the uncertainty that the dice provide is a huge part of what makes the game so much fun. So, if uncertainty is what makes the game so much fun, then surely that means that DMs also should never fudge a dice roll as well. Right? Well, for me, it's not actually as simple as that. I will say at this point that I'm fully open to having my mind changed, so if you actually disagree with me, and you've got a good reason for why you think DM should never, under any circumstances, fudge any dice rolls, let me know down in the comments. You might be able to change my mind completely and maybe I'll agree with you. But for now, let's move our viewpoint to the other side of the fence, the viewpoint of the Dungeon Masters. So firstly, what's the role of the Dungeon Master? They guide the story. Should a Dungeon Master ever fudge dice rolls in order to guide the story to where he or she or they want the story to go? No. Not in my opinion, that's not what it should be used for. If you're using it in that way, then in a sense, your story almost becomes railroading, which means that your players actually have very little agency over their actions and the impact of their actions on the game world. Most people will tell you that Dungeons & Dragons is actually about collaborative storytelling. Everybody who plays wants to have an impact on the story. So with that in mind, let's go back to the question, is it ever okay to fudge dice rolls? Despite everything that I've said, yes, I believe it is still okay in certain occasions for you as a Dungeon Master to fudge your dice rolls. Those that disagree with me, I want you to try and consider fudging as, rather than this unholy, sacrilegious act that you're not really supposed to do whilst playing Dungeons & Dragons, I want you to kind of think of it as a potential tool for you to use in certain situations. As a tool, it's actually extremely powerful if used correctly. Well, even if used incorrectly, it could really mess up your story and the trust that you have with your players if you don't use it carefully. An example of when I've used it, I've been running a long-term game with 3 of my friends, and another guy who was part of our friend group doesn't play Dungeons & Dragons, had never played it before, but because he'd heard us talking about it and everybody was getting excited about where the story was going, he actually wanted to join in and give it a go. Now, he did so, however, the characters at this point were level 6 or 7, and they were in combat with some gnolls. Now, during this combat, Tom, who was the new player playing for the first time ever, he actually got himself in a little bit of trouble. He made some suboptimal choices as a character, as we all do when we're first starting off in Dungeons & Dragons. His character was almost at 0 hit points. So at that point, I'm rolling another attack as a gnoll, and it's actually an attack that hits and would do enough damage to knock Tom unconscious in his first ever combat with D&D. However, for me, that's not really an enjoyable first experience for somebody who's playing for the first time, to get knocked unconscious in your first battle and kind of feel a little bit useless whilst everybody else is going around doing all these cool things. For me, that just it wasn't the impression that I wanted to give a brand new player. So I'll be honest, I fudged the dice roll and had it so that he only had 1 hit point left. Now, what that did was it upped the drama, upped the ante, because he felt vulnerable in that moment, and it also meant that actually in the next round it came to the final gnoll and Tom actually got the killing blow. Now again, when he rolled damage for his hit that did hit, his damage was short of actually being able to kill the gnoll by 1 or 2 points. I, as the DM, made the call that actually that hit was going to be enough to kill that gnoll, because I knew it would give him and the other players at the table a memorable experience. It would give him something to go away from the table and talk about with our friendship group. He could now actually be involved as part of those conversations because he'd had that really cool moment. Now, had I fudged the dice rolls? Yes. However, had it been for the benefit of the game and for the group? I believe so, yes. Now for me, there's actually some laws when it comes to fudging. The laws of fudging, if you want to call it that. The first one, and probably the most important one, is you never ever tell your players that you have fudged a dice roll, under any circumstances. Even if they ask you outright, you're just going to have to roll a deception check for yourself in person and lie about it. Never, ever, ever tell your players that you have fudged a dice roll. It ruins the immersion, and also it will have them second guessing you in the future. If they know that you've fudged a dice roll in the past, they will second guess their achievements, and they'll second guess whether their success stories were actually because they did well or they came up with a smart idea, or was it actually just because the DM wanted it to succeed, so he or she or they fudged the dice roll. The second law for me is use it only as a last resort. You shouldn't be fudging dice rolls every single time. I wouldn't even say that I fudge a dice roll every single session, to be honest with you. These days I probably only have to do it once every 4 or 5 sessions, if even that. I've not really been counting, but it's pretty rare that I have to do it. Where possible, fudge to help, not to harm. Don't boost the attack rolls of the creatures that are fighting the PCs, because you never know what impact that's going to have. You might boost an attack roll and it only does 2 damage, and you think it's not that big a deal, but then later on in the fight, it might come down to a point where one of your player characters only has 2 hit points left, and maybe because of your fudge dice roll, you've taken those away. So I never fudge to harm, I always fudge to help if I am going to. With that in mind as well, the fourth law is fudge correctly. Now what I mean by that is know your player character's stats. Track how many hit points they have, and whilst you're in combat, make sure that you know exactly how many hit points each player character has. Maybe you've led them into a highly unbalanced or imbalanced combat encounter, which was no fault of their own and they couldn't have avoided it, and actually maybe you just made the wrong calls as a DM when you were planning the session, and you need to help them out in order to get them through this combat. If you've been tracking their hit points, you can fudge the dice rolls so that the attack hits, however it doesn't quite do enough damage to kill the player character. Similar to how I told you about my story with Tom. I could do that because I was tracking how many hit points he had, and I could use that situation to actually build drama and build tension and make the combat more interesting and more memorable. So know your player character stats, and that's not just hit points, that's also armor class. Maybe you don't want the creature or the enemy to hit your player character at all. So in that case, you need to know the armor class. The best way that I can explain it is think about this delivery. If you are trying to fudge a dice roll on how much damage a creature has delivered to one of your players, if you already know how many hit points that player has, you know they've got 10 hit points left, you can fudge the dice roll and say they do 9 points of damage. And then you can ask them, how many hit points do you have? And they'll say, oh, I have 10. And there you go. There's that big dramatic moment of, wow, that player character only has 1 hit point left. It sounds a little bit different if you roll for damage and then you ask the player character, how many hit points have you got left? They reply with 10, and then you say, oh, they do 9 points of damage. There's just that little seed of doubt where they're like, well, did the DM actually roll 9 points of damage, or are they just saying that to save my player character? So that all comes from knowing your player character's stats and tracking them through combat. It's a little bit extra work, but it does pay off big time. Now my final law is to learn from the fudge. Why did you have to fudge that dice roll? Like I said, have you set up an imbalanced combat encounter? How can you avoid that in future? Or maybe you created a room where for the PCs to progress through, you actually made it too difficult. You made it so that it was a super high perception check to spot the button that opens the door, for example. Learn from that. Maybe next time, make the button that opens the door very obvious so that they know exactly what it is that they have to do to get through to the next stage of the dungeon or wherever it is that they're at. And if you want to add challenge to it, do something like add a trap or add a riddle or a puzzle or something like that. Make the path obvious, but the perils hidden. That's what you want to do. Rather than hiding the path and making it so that it's unclear what they have to do, and then you get this scenario where your player characters are stuck in a room and nobody really knows what to do. Make it obvious what they need to do, but hide some of the challenges that are stopping them from getting there. Not all of them, but some of them. Now, just briefly, whilst we're talking about this, I want to go to another subject that's kind of related, which is, should you always roll behind the DM screen or should you ever roll in front of the DM screen? Now, for me, I 99% of the time roll behind the DM screen. However, there are occasions where rolling in front of the DM screen can provide you with a huge payoff. One example of that, one of my players was a paladin, and they were being hunted down by a paladin from the same religion. However, there was kind of like a civil war going on within this guy's religion. A fight breaks out. My player character, his PC actually gets knocked unconscious. The enemy that's been hunting him then says to the rest of his party, put down your weapons, otherwise he dies. Now, of course, because this is D&D, the party doesn't put down their weapons. The ranger fires off one attack. It doesn't hit. The combat round goes on. The unconscious player character fails their first death saving throw, and then it comes back around to the enemy's turn. Now, he has issued a promise, and he gave the party an option, an out if you like, and they didn't take it. So therefore, I had to roll an attack on the unconscious player character. Seems harsh, but for me, the party made their decision that they wanted to continue the combat rather than stop it. So I had to play that character, or I had to play that enemy true to what they would do. And they attacked the unconscious character. Now, he'd already failed one death saving throw. So I explained it to the party that as an unconscious character, if you suffer an attack, it's an automatic failed death saving throw. If the attack is a critical hit, then it's 2 failed saving throws, which would mean that this player character was dead and there's no coming back from it. Now, after explaining that, I took my dice and I showed that I was going to roll it in front of the DM screen, which for this party, for this group, was the first time I'd ever done that. So everybody's attention was immediately sucked in. They knew the stakes, they knew what was at play, and they knew what the results would be if the certain roll came out in the way that they feared. And of course, the dice gods adjudged that it would be a natural 20. I rolled the dice, natural 20 comes up on the table, player character is killed, and it again provides one of those memorable moments where, oh, there was one time that the DM rolled the dice in front of us and it was a natural 20 and it killed one of our player characters. And at the time, it was really horrible, actually. I never like killing player characters. However, still to this day, when I ask them about what's been some of their most memorable moments of the campaign, that moment is still up there. And that's probably because the roll was in front of the screen. Obviously, it was a natural 20. It resulted in a player character death. It was kind of a perfect storm. So for me, rolling in front of the screen, very useful tool, but try and, again, similar to fudging dice rolls, try and use it sparingly to use it to its best effect. So what can we take from all of this? Well, for me, DMing is an art form. You improve as you log more hours. You know, once you've done 10 hours of DMing, you're better than when you'd only done 1 or 2. Once you've done 100, 200, 300, all of a sudden you start to be able to make calls on the fly off the top of your head, and they will improve the game because you've got that experience behind you. Fudging dice rolls plays into that. It's all about knowing how to balance the game for the good of your players and your table. At the end of the day, you can listen to all of these different people, give their opinions on whether they think it's right, whether they think it's wrong, and there's valid arguments on both sides. But for your table, only you will know the answer. Again, due to the polarizing kind of subject and the way it's thought of when it's discussed, it's probably best not to actually discuss this with your players and just to make this call yourself, because again, it can damage that trust between DM and players. So this is one that you're going to have to make a judgment call on. Follow your own instincts and trust your own ability to make these types of calls. That's what being a DM is. You're making calls for the betterment of the game. Now, I'm really, really interested to hear other opinions on this subject, so please let me know down in the comments what you think. As I said, I'm very open to changing my mind. Maybe there's a very valid argument for never using fudge dice rolls ever, and maybe there's a valid argument for using them quite often. Let me know down in the comments. Throw me a like if you enjoyed the video. Make sure you subscribe to catch future videos as they come out. Thank you so much for watching. Be good, guys.